Welcome back to Fear Rest. In today's episode, I'm sharing 8 true disturbing stories from the isolated mountain roads of West Virginia. These are tales of people who ventured into forgotten hollows and winding back roads and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The stretch of Route 39 between Marlinton and Cranberry Glades never felt quite right, even in daylight. My uncle had driven it 100 times hauling timber, and he'd always mention how the tree line seemed to press closer there than anywhere else in Webster County. The canopy was so thick that even at noon, the road existed in this sort of permanent dusk. When I was 23, I got a job doing survey work for the State Forestry Department, and one of my assignments took me down that exact stretch. I remember packing my gear the night before and my uncle watching me from the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with his coffee, and then finally he told me to make sure I was off that road before dark. I laughed it off. I'd grown up in these mountains. What was I going to be afraid of? The work itself was straightforward, measuring tree density and checking for invasive species in a section about 2 miles off the main road. The access path wasn't even really a road, more like 2 packed dirt ruts that wound upward through old-growth forest. My truck handled it fine, though I had to take it slow. I'd brought a thermos of coffee and a sandwich I'd made that morning, turkey and Swiss on wheat bread that was already getting a little soggy by the time I parked. The site they'd marked on my map was about a quarter mile from where the path ended, so I loaded my pack and started walking. It was early September, and the air had that heavy, wet quality it gets right before autumn really takes hold. Everything smelled like moss and rotting leaves. I remember my boots making almost no sound on the forest floor, just this soft compression of mulch and pine needles. The trees were massive, old oaks and hemlocks that must have been there for a century or more. I'd been working maybe 2 hours, taking measurements and marking GPS coordinates, when I realized I hadn't heard a single bird since I'd arrived. Not one. You don't really notice forest sounds until they're gone, but once I picked up on it, it felt obvious. No birds, no squirrels rustling through underbrush. Nothing. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe there was a hawk nearby, or maybe I just walked into a dead pocket. The forest has rhythms, and sometimes you land in a quiet spot. But my shoulders had gone tense, and I caught myself listening instead of working. That's when I saw the first marker. It was just a strip of cloth, faded red, tied around a tree trunk about 30 feet ahead of me. I walked over to it. The fabric was old, sun-bleached and frayed, but the knot was deliberate. Someone had placed it there on purpose. I looked around and spotted another one and then another. They formed a line leading deeper into the woods, away from my survey area. I should have ignored them. I had work to finish, and the markers weren't part of my job. But there was something about the way they were arranged, perfectly spaced, maybe 50 feet apart, leading into a section of forest that looked darker than the rest. I told myself I'd follow them just far enough to see what they marked, and then I'd head back. The first 6 or 7 were tied to trees at eye level. Then they started getting lower. By the time I'd walked maybe 200 yards, the cloth strips were tied to saplings close to the ground, and I had to crouch to see them clearly. That's when I found the stone. It was flat and smooth, about the size of a dinner plate, and it had been placed deliberately in the center of a small clearing. The ground around it looked disturbed, not freshly dug, but compressed, like something heavy had been resting there for a long time and had only recently been moved. I knelt down next to it. There were symbols scratched into the surface, crude but intentional. They didn't look like any language I recognized. Just shapes, spirals, and intersecting lines. My mouth went dry, I don't know why. It wasn't threatening exactly, but seeing it made me feel like I'd walked into someone's house without knocking. I stood up and looked around the clearing. That's when I noticed the trees. 3 of them, arranged in a rough triangle around the stone, had deep vertical gouges in the bark. The cuts were uniform, like they'd been made with a blade, and they ran from about chest height all the way down to the roots. The wood inside the gouges was dark and old. These weren't fresh marks. I felt my pulse starting to pick up. I told myself it was probably just some old hunting marker or a boundary stone from decades ago. People used to mark property lines with all kinds of strange symbols. But the rational part of my brain was losing ground to the part that wanted me to get the hell out of there. I turned to leave and nearly tripped over something. At first I thought it was a root, but when I looked down, I saw it was a piece of metal, an old railroad spike, driven into the ground at an angle. I crashed down again and brushed away some of the leaves. There were more of them, 6 spikes, arranged in a circle around the stone, all pointing inward. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to set this up, and they'd done it a long time ago. That's when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere behind me, deeper in the woods. At first I thought it was wind moving through the trees, but the air was completely still. It was more like a low hum, rhythmic and steady, rising and falling. I froze. The sound continued for maybe 10 seconds and then it stopped. I waited, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. And then I heard it again, closer this time. Not a hum, a voice. Someone was singing. I couldn't make out the words, but the melody was slow and deliberate, almost like a chant. And it was coming toward me. I didn't run right away. I should have, but for some stupid reason I stayed where I was, staring into the trees, trying to see who was out there. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool air. I took a step backward and a branch snapped under my boot. The sound echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. Something moved in the tree line. I saw it for maybe 3 seconds. It was tall, too tall and pale. The skin looked wrong, almost gray, stretched tight over a frame that didn't move like a person. The limbs were too long, and when it shifted its weight, the joints bent in ways that made my stomach turn. It didn't have a face. Or maybe it did, and my brain just refused to process what I was seeing. I don't know. What I do know is that when it took a step forward, it didn't make a sound. No footstep, no rustling leaves, just silent movement through the underbrush. I ran. I crashed back through the woods the way I'd come, branches whipping across my face, my pack slamming against my back with every stride. I didn't look behind me. I didn't stop. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and panicked, and underneath that, I swear I could hear something else. Footsteps, but wrong, too fast and too light. I reached the dirt path and kept running, my lungs burning, until I saw my truck. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them, and then I was inside with the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. Even then I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something standing in the road behind me. When I got home that night, I pulled everything out of my pack to put it away. That's when I found it, a piece of that faded red cloth, neatly folded, sitting on top of my gear. I hadn't touched those markers. I never got close enough to take one, but there it was. I requested a transfer to a different district the next week. I've never driven Route 39 again, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear that singing in my head. Story 2. My cousin Shelby and I used to spend summers at her grandmother's place up near Helvetia, which is this tiny little Swiss settlement tucked into the Appalachian hills. The house itself was over 100 years old, built from local stone, and it sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through dense forest for about 3 miles. Shelby's grandmother had passed away that spring, and the family decided Shelby should go up and sort through the house before they put it on the market. She asked if I'd come with her. I think she didn't want to be alone up there, though she never said it outright. I just finished my sophomore year of college and didn't have anything better to do, so I agreed. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in late June. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the mid-70s, everything green and alive. I remember Shelby had made this whole playlist for the drive, and we sang along to half of it before the road got too winding and she had to concentrate. The house looked exactly like I remembered it. Gray stone walls, a sagging front porch, windows with the original wavy glass. The inside smelled like dust and old wood, and something floral I couldn't quite place. Shelby's grandmother had been a quilter, and there were unfinished projects stacked on every surface. We spent the first few hours just wandering through rooms, opening closets, pulling boxes down from shelves. Around 7, we made sandwiches from the groceries we'd brought and ate them on the porch. The forest was loud with insects and birds, and the light was starting to go golden and soft through the trees. Shelby told me about the summers she'd spent there as a kid, how her grandmother used to take her on walks through the woods and point out plants, wild ginger, ramps, bloodroot. She said the old woman had known every inch of those hills. I asked if she'd ever gotten lost, and Shelby laughed and said no, her grandmother had a sense for the land like some people have for music. We decided to stay the night rather than drive back in the dark. The house had 2 bedrooms upstairs, and we each claimed one. I was exhausted from the drive and the sorting, so I brushed my teeth in the old porcelain sink and collapsed into bed around 10. I fell asleep almost immediately. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the room was pitch black and completely silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. I lay there for a minute trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep, and then I heard it, a soft tapping sound like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the window. I sat up slowly, my heart already starting to race. The curtains were drawn, just thin fabric that let in a little bit of moonlight. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Pause, tap, tap, tap. I told myself it was a branch brushing against the window, even though I knew there weren't any trees close enough to reach the second floor. I got out of bed and crossed the room, my bare feet cold on the wood floor. I reached for the curtain and hesitated. Part of me didn't want to look, but the tapping continued, and I couldn't just stand there. I pulled the curtain back. There was nothing outside, just darkness and the faint outline of trees in the distance. I pressed my face close to the glass and looked down toward the porch, empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. And then from directly above me I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps crossing the roof, back and forth, back and forth. The house didn't have a third floor. There was nothing above me but attic crawl space and shingles. I stood there frozen, listening to the sound of something walking across the roof, and then I heard Shelby's voice from the other room. "Are you hearing this?" she called out, and I felt a rush of relief that I wasn't the only one awake. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. Shelby was standing in a doorway, her face pale. "What is that?" she whispered. I didn't answer. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. And then we both heard it, a long, slow scraping sound, like something being dragged across the roof toward the edge of the house. We went downstairs. I don't remember making the decision. We just moved, both of us, down the stairs and into the living room. Shelby turned on every light she could find. We sat on the couch together, not talking, just listening. The scraping sound had stopped, but now we could hear something else. A faint scratching coming from the walls. It moved around the room, circling us. I tried to convince myself it was mice or squirrels, but the sound was too loud, too deliberate. It stopped near the fireplace and stayed there. Around 3 in the morning, it finally went quiet. We didn't sleep. We just sat there waiting for the sun to come up. When the first light started filtering through the windows, Shelby got up and went to the kitchen to make coffee. I stood up and stretched, my whole body stiff and aching. That's when I noticed the fireplace. The grate had been moved. It was sitting on the hearth, a few feet away from where it should have been. And inside the fireplace, scratched into the sooty brick, were words. They weren't in English, or maybe they were, but the letters were so malformed I couldn't read them. They looked like they'd been carved with something sharp, and they were still fresh. Black dust was scattered on the floor below them. I called Shelby over, and she just stared at it. "We need to leave," she said quietly. I nodded. We loaded everything we'd brought back into the car and left. We didn't pack up the house. We didn't lock the doors. We just got in the car and drove until we hit the main highway. Shelby called her parents from the road and told them she couldn't finish the job. She didn't explain why. They ended up hiring an estate sale company to clear the place out. I don't know if anyone ever saw what was written in that fireplace, or if it was still there when they arrived. About a week later, Shelby called me. She said she'd been going through the photos on her phone from the trip, and there was one she didn't remember taking. It was a picture of the upstairs hallway, taken from inside her bedroom, looking out toward the stairs. The timestamp said 2:47 a.m. In the background, just barely visible in the darkness, there was a figure standing at the top of the stairs, too tall to be either of us. We never talked about it again. Story 3. I got hired on with a utility crew the summer I turned 28, doing line work in some of the more remote parts of Pocahontas County. The pay was decent, and the work kept me outside, which I preferred. Most of the job was routine, replacing old poles, clearing branches away from power lines, checking transformers. But every once in a while, we'd get called out to some property so far back in the hills, you'd wonder how anyone even knew the power was out. That's how I ended up on Duggan Road. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A woman named Iris Kowalski had phoned the company saying her power had been out for 3 days and no one had come to check on it. The dispatcher gave me the address and told me it was about 40 minutes outside of Marlinton, up a private road. I loaded my gear into the truck and headed out. The drive was easy at first, paved county roads, a few farms, nothing unusual. Then I turned onto Duggan Road, and the pavement ended. The road became gravel, then dirt, then just 2 tire tracks through the woods. I drove for maybe 20 minutes, the truck bouncing over ruts and exposed roots before I reached the property. The house was small, more like a cabin, with a metal roof and a front porch stacked with firewood. An older woman was standing in the doorway watching me pull up. I got out and introduced myself. She nodded and said she was Iris. Her voice was flat, almost suspicious. She told me the power had gone out sometime Friday night, and she'd been using a generator since then. I asked if she'd noticed anything unusual, a storm, a down line, anything. She said no, it had just gone dark. I walked the property line, checking the poles and lines. Everything looked intact. No breaks, no damage, nothing obviously wrong. I told Iris I'd need to check the transformer, which was located about 100 yards into the woods behind her house. She didn't say anything, just nodded and went back inside. I grabbed my tools and started walking. The path to the transformer was overgrown, barely visible under layers of dead leaves and vines. I had to push through underbrush to make progress, and more than once I had to stop and check my map to make sure I was headed in the right direction. The woods felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. The trees were too close together, and the light filtering through the canopy had this strange greenish tint. I kept glancing around, feeling like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. When I reached the transformer, I saw the problem immediately. The access panel was open, hanging from one hinge. The wiring inside had been pulled out, not cut, but yanked, like someone had grabbed fistfuls of it and ripped it free. Copper wire was strewn on the ground around the base of the pole, twisted and tangled. I stood there staring at it, trying to figure out what could have done this. Animals don't open access panels. People don't usually vandalize transformers in the middle of the woods, but someone or something had. I radioed back to the dispatcher and told them I'd need a replacement panel and new wiring. They said it would take a couple of hours to get the materials out to me. I sat down on a fallen log to wait, and that's when I noticed the tracks. They were in the soft dirt near the base of the transformer pole, boot prints, but wrong. The tread was worn smooth and the prints were deep, like whoever made them was carrying a lot of weight. But what unsettled me was the spacing. They were too far apart. No one walks with a stride that wide. I followed the tracks about 30 feet into the woods. They stopped at a tree, a big old oak with bark so dark it looked almost black, and carved into the trunk at eye level were initials. DK below them was a date, 1987. I reached out and touched the carving. The wood inside was still raw, not weathered like you'd expect from something almost 40 years old. It looked fresh. That's when I heard the breathing. It was close, maybe 10 feet away, deep and slow. I turned around, scanning the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The breathing continued, steady and deliberate, and then it stopped. The silence that followed made my skin crawl. I backed toward the transformer, my hand reaching for the radio on my belt. And then I saw it, something pale, crouched in the underbrush about 20 yards away. It wasn't moving, just watching me. I couldn't see details. The shape was wrong, hunched and elongated, and the way it held itself reminded me of an animal, but the proportions were all off. I took another step back and it shifted, not toward me, just a slight adjustment, like it was settling into a more comfortable position. And then it made a sound, a low clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, like it was trying to communicate. I ran. I didn't care about the equipment or the wiring. I just ran back toward the house, crashing through the underbrush, my lungs burning. When I broke through the tree line into Iris's yard, she was standing on the porch again, watching me. "You saw it," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, gasping for air. She sighed and shook her head. "You should go," she told me. "I'll call someone else." I didn't argue. I got in my truck and drove back down that dirt road as fast as I could without rolling the vehicle. When I got back to the shop, I told my supervisor I couldn't finish the job. He asked why, and I said I'd gotten sick. He didn't push it. A different crew went out the next day to finish the repair. When they came back, one of the guys mentioned that the woman who lived there had been strange, kept talking about something in the woods. They laughed about it. I didn't. About a month later, I was going through some old work orders and saw that same address pop up, Duggan Road. The note said the crew had found the transformer vandalized again, the same way, wiring ripped out, panel hanging open. No explanation. The company decided it wasn't worth repairing and disconnected the line permanently. I looked up the property records out of curiosity. Iris Kowalski had owned that land since 1986. Before that, it belonged to someone named David Kowalski. He died in 1987. The circumstances were listed as unknown. Story 4. My brother Trevor and I inherited a hunting cabin from our grandfather when he passed in the spring of 2019. The place was up near Seneca Rocks, tucked into a hollow about 3 miles off the main road. We'd been there a handful of times as kids, but it had been sitting vacant for at least a decade by the time we got the keys. Trevor wanted to sell it, but I convinced him we should at least go up and check it out first, maybe see if it was worth fixing up. We drove out on a Saturday in early October when the leaves were just starting to turn. The cabin was smaller than I remembered, one main room with a wood stove, a tiny bedroom, and an outhouse about 50 feet from the back door. The roof looked solid, and the windows were intact, which was more than I'd expected. We spent the afternoon sweeping out mouse droppings and clearing cobwebs, and by the time the sun started to set, the place almost felt livable. Trevor suggested we stay the night, just to see what it was like. I agreed. We had sleeping bags in the truck and enough food for a couple of meals. We built a fire in the stove and sat around eating jerky and drinking beer from a cooler we'd brought. Trevor was in a good mood, talking about maybe turning the cabin into a weekend retreat, bringing his kids up once they were old enough. I wasn't really listening. I kept glancing at the windows, watching the darkness settle over the hollow. The forest around the cabin was dense, and once the sun went down, it felt like the trees pressed right up against the walls. Around 9, Trevor said he was going to step outside and take a piss. He grabbed a flashlight and went out the front door. I stayed by the stove, poking at the fire, listening to the wood crackle and pop. A couple of minutes passed, and then I heard Trevor shout. Not a scream, more like a startled yell. I grabbed my own flashlight and rushed outside. Trevor was standing about 20 feet from the cabin, shining his light into the woods. "What the hell is that?" he said, his voice tight. I came up beside him and followed his beam. At first I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. And then I saw it, a shape standing motionless between 2 pines. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin, too thin. The proportions were wrong, like someone had taken a person and stretched them. "Is that someone?" Trevor asked. I didn't answer. We both stood there staring, and the shape didn't move. The flashlight beam reflected off something pale, skin maybe, or clothing. I couldn't tell. Trevor called out, "Hey, you need help?" No response. The shape remained perfectly still. Trevor took a step forward and I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said. I don't know why. Instinct maybe. Something about the way it stood there felt wrong. We backed toward the cabin, keeping our lights on the figure. It didn't follow, it just watched us, or at least I think it did. I couldn't make out a face. When we reached the door, Trevor ducked inside first and I followed. We shut the door and locked it, though the lock was old and flimsy. Trevor went to the window and looked out. "It's gone," he said. I came over and checked. He was right. The space between the trees was empty. We didn't talk much after that. We sat by the stove, listening to the fire burn down. Around midnight, we heard something on the roof. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing from one end of the cabin to the other. Trevor looked at me, his face pale. "Animal," he whispered. I shook my head. The steps were too evenly spaced, too heavy. They crossed back the other way and then stopped. We waited. The silence stretched out, oppressive and thick. And then we heard scratching, long, slow drags like nails or claws scraping against the metal roof. Trevor stood up and grabbed a tire iron from his bag. "We should check it out," he said. I told him that was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard, but he was already moving toward the door. I followed him because I wasn't going to let him go out there alone. We stepped onto the porch, our flashlights sweeping the roof. Nothing. Trevor walked around the side of the cabin, and I trailed behind him. When we reached the back, he stopped so suddenly, I almost ran into him. There were scratches in the metal roof, deep gouges that ran in parallel lines, like someone had dragged a rake across it. But the marks were fresh, shining metal showing through the rust. And underneath the roof's overhang, pressed into the soft dirt, were handprints, not human. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow. Trevor stared at them, and I watched his expression go from confusion to fear. "We are leaving," I said. He nodded. We packed up in under 5 minutes, throwing our stuff into the truck without bothering to fold or organize anything. I started the engine, and we headed down the dirt road as fast as I dared, the headlights bouncing over ruts and rocks. About halfway to the main road, Trevor grabbed my arm and pointed. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, was the shape we'd seen earlier. It was closer now, and I got a better look. The limbs were impossibly long, hanging past its knees, and the head was tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. It didn't move as we drove past. It just watched. We sold the property 3 months later. As is, neither of us ever went back. About a year after the sale, I got a call from a real estate agent asking if we knew anything about the cabin's history. She said the new owners had found something disturbing inside, symbols carved into the floorboards under where the stove had been. She wanted to know if we'd seen them. I told her no. I hung up and blocked the number. I don't want to know what they found. Story 5. I moved to West Virginia in 2017 to take a job as a paramedic in Greenbrier County. The work was steady and the area was beautiful, but the pay wasn't great, so I picked up shifts doing private transport when I could. One of those shifts took me up to a place called Hearns Mill, which isn't even really a town, just a handful of houses scattered along a ridgeline. The call was for an elderly man named Oscar Tremming who needed to be transporting to a facility in Lewisburg. Non-emergency, routine stuff. I arrived at the address around 6 in the evening. The house was old, probably early 1900s, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Oscar was waiting in a wheelchair, a small duffel bag on his lap. His daughter was there too, a woman in her 50s named Brenda, who seemed anxious to get him out of the house. She helped me load Oscar into the ambulance and then handed me a folded piece of paper. "He's going to try to tell you things," she said quietly. "Don't listen." "He's not well," I nodded, assuming she meant dementia or confusion. The drive started out fine. Oscar was quiet at first, staring out the back windows at the darkening hills. About 20 minutes in, he spoke. "You know where you are?" he asked. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Heading toward Lewisburg," I said. He shook his head. "No, I mean here, this road." I told him I didn't and he smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "You should," he said. "People used to disappear here. Back in the 50s, 60s, they'd find the cars but never the people." I didn't respond. I've learned not to engage too much with patients who start talking like that, but Oscar kept going. "My brother was one of them," he said. 1962, he was driving home from work and they found his truck on the shoulder, engine still running, lights on, door open, no sign of him. I glanced at the mirror again. Oscar was still staring out the window, his expression distant. They looked for him for weeks. Never found a body. My mother used to say something took him, something that lived in the hollows. The road had gotten narrower, winding through dense forest. The sun had set, and my headlights were the only illumination. I told Oscar I was sorry about his brother, trying to be polite, and he laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "You don't believe me," he said. "That's fine, but you'll see, it's still out there." About 10 minutes later, the ambulance started making a strange noise, a low grinding from somewhere under the hood. I eased off the gas and pulled onto the shoulder, my hazards flashing. I radioed dispatch and told them I was having mechanical trouble. They said they'd send a tow, but it would take at least an hour to reach me. I got out and popped the hood, shining my flashlight over the engine. I'm not a mechanic, but everything looked normal. No obvious leaks, no loose belts. I got back in the cab and told Oscar we'd be waiting for a bit. He didn't seem surprised. "I told you," he said softly. "It knows." I tried to ignore him. I checked my phone, no signal, not unusual out here. I turned on the cab's interior light and settled in to wait. Oscar had gone quiet again, his eyes fixed on the woods outside. After about 20 minutes I heard something, a low sound like wind moving through the trees, except the air was completely still. I looked at Oscar. He was sitting very rigid in his wheelchair, his hands gripping the armrests. "Don't go outside," he said. The sound got louder, and I realized it wasn't wind. It was voices, multiple voices overlapping, speaking in low murmurs I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to come from all around the ambulance surrounding us. My pulse started to pick up. I reached for the radio, but before I could key the mic, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No insects, no wind, nothing. And then something tapped on the side of the ambulance. It was a soft sound, almost polite, like someone knocking on a door. Tap, tap, tap. I sat frozen, my hand hovering over the radio. The tapping came again, this time on the back doors, then on the driver's side window. It moved around the vehicle, circling us, always the same rhythm. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Oscar was whispering something too low for me to hear, and I didn't ask him to repeat it. The tapping stopped. I waited, barely breathing, and then the ambulance rocked slightly, like something had pressed its weight against the side. I heard a long, slow scrape, metal on metal, running from the back of the vehicle toward the front. It stopped just outside my window. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just stared straight ahead, my hands clenched on the wheel. After what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, I saw headlights approaching from behind. The tow truck. The driver pulled up and got out. a heavy-set man in a stained jacket. He walked up to my window and tapped on it, a normal human tap. I rolled it down and he asked what the problem was. I told him the engine had been making noise. He said he'd take a look. He spent maybe 10 minutes under the hood, and then he came back and told me everything looked fine. He suggested I try starting it again. I did. The engine turned over immediately, smooth and quiet. No grinding, no noise at all. I thanked him, and he drove off. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dark road ahead, and then I put the ambulance in gear and started driving. Oscar didn't say anything for the rest of the trip. When we arrived at the facility in Lewisburg, I helped him inside and handed him off to the staff. As I was leaving, he grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "You were lucky," he said. "It let you go." I got back in the ambulance and drove straight home. When I got there, I checked the exterior of the vehicle. There were scratches along both sides, long parallel marks that ran from the back doors all the way to the cab, deep enough to scrape through the paint. I reported the damage to my supervisor the next day and said I must have clipped a tree branch. He didn't question it. I quit the private transport job 2 weeks later. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been outside that ambulance, circling us, deciding whether to let us leave. I still don't know what it was. And I never drove that road again. Story 6. My girlfriend Paige and I decided to take a weekend camping trip in the Monongahela National Forest in the fall of 2018. We'd been talking about getting out of the city for a while, and the forecast was perfect. Cool nights, clear skies. We packed our tent and gear and drove out on a Friday afternoon. The plan was to hike in a couple of miles to a spot Paige had found on a trail map, set up camp, and spend the weekend disconnected from everything. The trailhead was about 40 minutes outside of Elkins, down a gravel road that ended at a small parking area. There were no other cars, which we took as a good sign. We shouldered our packs and started walking. The trail was well maintained at first, wide and clearly marked, cutting through a mixed forest of oak and pine. The leaves were just starting to change color, and the light filtering through the canopy had this warm, golden quality. Paige was in a great mood, talking about how we should do this more often, how nice it was to be away from screens and traffic. About 2 miles in, the trail narrowed and started to climb. We were both breathing hard by the time we reached the ridgeline. The map showed a flat area just ahead where we could set up camp, and when we got there, it was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with a fire ring someone had left behind. We dropped our packs and spent the next hour setting up the tent and gathering firewood. By the time we finished, the sun was starting to set, and the temperature was dropping fast. We built a fire and cooked dinner, freeze-dried chili that tasted better than it had any right to. Paige was leaning against a log, drinking hot chocolate from a thermos, and I was feeding sticks into the fire. The woods around us were alive with sound, insects, birds settling down for the night, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It felt idyllic. Round 9, Paige yawned and said she was going to turn in. I told her I'd stay up a bit longer and keep the fire going. I sat there for maybe another hour watching the flames, letting my mind wander. The fire was starting to die down and I was about to bank it and head to the tent when I heard something. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through dead leaves. I looked up, expecting to see a deer, but the sound was too heavy. Human maybe, but we were miles from the nearest trail junction. I stood up and called out, "Hello?" No answer. The footsteps continued, circling the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and branches, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, my heart starting to race, and then I heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it sounded like my name. "Alex," it said, drawn out and slow. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned in a circle, sweeping the flashlight around the clearing, but there was no one there. The voice came again, closer this time. "Alex." It sounded like Paige. I spun toward the tent, ready to unzip it and check on her, but then I heard her actual voice, muffled and groggy from inside. "What's going on?" she called. I didn't answer. If Paige was in the tent, then who or what had just called my name? I moved toward the tent and crouched down next to the entrance. "Stay inside," I said quietly. Paige sat up and I could see her silhouette through the fabric. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharper now. I told her I'd heard something and she went quiet. We both listened. For a long moment there was nothing, and then we heard it, footsteps again, but this time they were closer, right at the edge of the clearing. And then another voice, different from the first. a man's voice, low and raspy. "Help me," it said. "Please help me." Paige grabbed my arm through the tent wall. "Don't go out there," she whispered. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. The voice called out again, more insistent. "I'm hurt, please." It sounded desperate, convincing. Every instinct I had was telling me to help, but something deeper, more primal, was screaming at me to stay put. I didn't move. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the calling. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and fast, and Paige's too. And then we heard movement, something large pushing through the underbrush, circling the tent. It wasn't trying to be quiet. The sound was deliberate, like it wanted us to know it was there. Paige was squeezing my arm so hard it hurt. "What do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. The circling continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. And then it stopped. The silence stretched out, and I realized the fire had gone completely out. We were in total darkness except for my flashlight, which I dropped somewhere near the tent entrance. I reached for it slowly, my hand shaking, and clicked it on. The beam illuminated the clearing. Empty. I swept the light across the tree line. Nothing. We stayed in the tent until dawn, neither of us sleeping. When the sun finally started to rise, we packed up as quickly as we could and hiked back to the car. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What was there to say? About a week later, Paige was going through the photos we'd taken on the trip. There was one she didn't remember taking, shot from inside the tent looking out through the mesh door. The timestamp said 11:43 p.m. In the darkness beyond the tent, barely visible, was a shape. It was standing upright, tall and thin, just at the edge of where the firelight would have reached. We never went back to that trail, and we haven't gone camping since. Story 7. I worked as a courier for a medical supply company for about 3 years, delivering everything from prescription medications to equipment to hospitals and clinics across southern West Virginia. Most of the deliveries were straightforward, but every once in a while I'd get an address that made me check the GPS twice because it seemed impossible. That's how I ended up on Laurel Creek Road. The delivery was for a home health nurse named Nora Pemberton, who needed a portable oxygen concentrator for a patient. The address was listed as being near Raynell, but when I plugged it into my GPS, the route took me way out past the town limits, onto roads that got progressively narrower and more rural. I'd been driving for about 40 minutes when the pavement ended, and the road turned to gravel. The GPS kept insisting I was on the right track, so I kept going. The road climbed steadily, winding through dense forest. I passed a few driveways, long dirt paths that disappeared into the trees, but no houses were visible from the road. After another 15 minutes, the GPS announced I'd arrived at my destination. I pulled over and looked around. There was nothing. No house, no mailbox, no sign of any structure, just trees and a narrow path leading off to the right. I grabbed the concentrator from the back of the van and started walking down the path, figuring the house must be set back from the road. The path was overgrown, and I had to push through branches and vines. After about 100 yards, I saw a clearing ahead, and in the clearing was a house, or what was left of one. The structure was old, maybe a century, and it had clearly been abandoned for years. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were either broken or missing entirely. I stopped and checked the address on my phone. This was definitely the place. I called the dispatch number and explained the situation. The dispatcher sounded confused and said she'd call the nurse to clarify. A few minutes later, she called me back and said the nurse had confirmed the address was correct and that I should leave the equipment on the porch. I asked if the house was even habitable, and the dispatcher said that's what the order specified. I didn't argue. I walked up to the porch. The steps creaked ominously under my weight and set the concentrator down near the door. As I was turning to leave, I noticed something. The door was slightly ajar, not wide open, just cracked, like someone had closed it but hadn't latched it. I could see darkness inside, and the smell coming from the house was overwhelming, rot and mildew and something metallic. I should have left right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open a little wider and shone my phone's flashlight inside. The interior was in even worse shape than the outside. The floor was covered in debris, fallen plaster, broken furniture, piles of wet leaves that had blown in through the broken windows. But what caught my eye was the far wall. There were markings on it, dark stains that looked like they'd been painted or smeared. At first I thought it was water damage, but as I stepped closer, I realized they were deliberate. Symbols arranged in rows, and below them, written in the same dark substance, was a sentence: "She's still here." I backed out of the house and nearly tripped over the porch steps. My heart was pounding, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I walked quickly back down the path to my van, looking over my shoulder every few feet. When I got to the vehicle, I sat in the driver's seat for a minute, trying to steady my breathing, and that's when I saw her. There was a woman standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet away. She was wearing a long dress, pale and dirty, and her hair hung down over her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there facing me. I stared at her and she stared back, or at least I think she did. I couldn't see her face clearly. I started the engine and she took a step forward. That was enough. I threw the van into reverse and backed down the gravel road until I found a wide enough spot to turn around. When I looked back, she was gone. I called dispatch when I got back to town and told them I'd delivered the equipment. I didn't mention what I'd seen. The next day I checked the delivery log out of curiosity. There was a note attached to the order: patient deceased, cancel future deliveries. The date of death was listed as 3 weeks before I'd made the delivery. I asked my supervisor about it, and he said sometimes orders get processed after a patient has already passed, especially in rural areas where communication is slow. He didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked up Nora Pemberton online and couldn't find any record of a home health nurse by that name in the area. I tried calling the phone number from the order, but it was disconnected. I even drove back out to Laurel Creek Road one more time in broad daylight to see if I could find the house again. I couldn't. The path I'd walked down was gone, or maybe I just couldn't find it. Either way, I never took another delivery in that area. I quit the job a few months later. Some things aren't worth the paycheck. Story 8. I was driving home from a friend's wedding in Charleston late one night in November, taking Route 60 back toward my apartment in Fayetteville. It was around 11, and the road was mostly empty, just me and the occasional semi hauling coal or timber. The temperature had dropped, and a light fog was starting to settle over the highway, the kind that makes your headlights reflect back at you and cuts visibility down to almost nothing. I'd been driving for maybe an hour when I saw someone standing on the shoulder of the road. A man, I thought, though I only caught a glimpse as I passed. He was just standing there facing the road, not waving for help or moving. I glanced in my rearview mirror and he was gone. Or maybe I'd just lost sight of him in the fog. I told myself he was probably fine, maybe waiting for a ride or taking a break from walking. But something about the way he'd been standing, perfectly still, stuck with me. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. Or someone who looked just like him. Same posture, same location on the shoulder, but this time on the opposite side of the road. I slowed down as I passed, trying to get a better look, but the fog was too thick. I checked the mirror again. Nothing. My hands were starting to sweat on the steering wheel. The road curved ahead, winding through a stretch of dense forest, and I had to focus on keeping the car steady. The third time I saw him, I was sure it was the same person. Same clothes, a dark jacket and jeans, same posture. But this time he was closer to the road, standing just at the edge of the white line. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding slightly on the damp pavement. The car stopped about 20 feet past him. I sat there, my heart pounding, and then I put the car in reverse. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could prove to myself that it was just someone who needed help, someone real and ordinary. I backed up slowly until my taillights illuminated the spot where he'd been standing. There was no one there. I put the car in park and got out, leaving the engine running. The fog was thicker now, curling around my legs, and the only sound was the hum of my car's engine. I walked to the edge of the shoulder and looked down into the ditch. Nothing. I scanned the tree line. Empty. I was about to get back in the car when I saw the footprints. They were in the soft dirt at the edge of the shoulder, leading from the spot where the man had been standing toward the woods. But they were wrong. The prints were deep, like someone had been carrying a lot of weight, and the stride was impossibly long, at least 6 feet between each step. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the trees, and then I heard a sound, a low hum, rhythmic and deliberate, like the one I'd heard in the woods years ago on that survey job. My blood went cold. I ran back to my car and got in, slamming the door and locking it. The humming got louder, and I realized it was coming from all around me, not just from the woods, but from the fog itself. I threw the car into drive and floored it, the engine roaring as I tore down the highway. The fog seemed to thicken, and for a moment I couldn't see anything at all. I nearly drove off the road twice before the fog finally started to clear. When I reached Fayetteville, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat in the parking lot with the engine off, trying to calm down. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a photo, a picture of my car taken from behind on the highway. In the background, barely visible in the fog, was a shape standing on the shoulder. The timestamp on the photo was from 20 minutes ago. I deleted the message and blocked the number. I told myself it was a prank, maybe someone messing with me. But when I got home and checked my car, I found something wedged under the rear windshield wiper. A piece of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it. Written in pencil, in handwriting that looked shaky and old, were 2 words: turn back. I still drive Route 60 sometimes when I have to, but I never drive it at night, and I never stop, no matter what I see on the side of the road. Outro. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.